Hi, the Mudbrooker here. Today I'm going to do a video answering some of the questions and comments that I've been getting on my other cast iron videos. I'm going to try and answer them as best I can, but I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because most of these topics I intend to address in more in-depth videos over the coming weeks and months. Some of the stuff is going to have to wait until I can do it outside, so it's going to have to wait till spring, but in the meantime I'm pretty sure I can cover a lot of stuff indoors. Before we get started, I would like to thank my patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate their support, and I'm going to have a little bit of blackberry brandy in their honor. I'd like to thank Eileen Edge, Benedict Riggers, Kay's Kist, Damian Bamer, Dan Sturgill, Joy Jones, Leo, Sue Beck, Theodore Engelkey, Valentin Tolman, and Tiarna Jones. I really appreciate all the support that you've given me, and hopefully you'll continue to do so. Thank you much. Anyway, well, the best place to start is in the beginning. People have asked what I recommend for people who are just beginning to use cast iron, and if new cast iron is worthwhile. The answer is yes, a lot of new cast iron is. For a beginner just starting out with cast iron, I highly recommend you get yourself something made by Lodge. This is a 10-inch Lodge skillet. You can find them almost anywhere that sells housewares, or camping goods even, because a lot of times you'll find cast iron pans in the outdoor department. This is, like I said, this is a 10-inch Lodge. These cost about 20 bucks brand new. You can find them cheaper on sale, and it's pre-seasoned. All you gotta do is wash it and you can start using it right away. Weight is a little bit of a concern for some people with cast iron, and this is a fairly hefty pan. This pan weighs right about 5 pounds. I'll get into that a little bit more later. What I highly recommend beginners avoid is something like this. This is a cheap little pan you can get at the dollar store, Dollar General, Walmart. They cost $8 or $10, and you're more than likely going to have problems with this. I'm not sure if the camera can really pick up the difference in the texture between the Lodge and this one. Where the Lodge has a pebbly texture, it's still fairly smooth to the touch. This has a very abrasive, very gritty, rough texture, and you're going to have a hard time with this because I can just about guarantee you're going to have problems with things sticking to this and getting this to season very well. That's not to say something like this is completely useless. I plan on using this for a guinea pig in a lot of the experiments and hideous torture tests I'm going to be doing here shortly. But with some work, you might be able to get this to where it's usable, and they're good for camping and things like that, where if you forget and leave it behind, you're not really out anything. Like I said, weight can be a concern, but I still suggest that you start off with a Lodge skillet. Find out if you like cooking with cast iron, if it's something you want to continue on with. And once you get a little experience, do a little bit of research, then you can start moving into more vintage pans, which are much, much lighter. Like I said, this 10-inch Lodge pan weighs about 5 pounds. A number 8 Griswold pan, which is the same size from the 1950s, weighs about 4 pounds. This skillet here, you'll see a little more of this later, is the next size bigger. This is a number 9 skillet, and it was made in 1906. This pan, even though it's larger, weighs a little under 3.5 pounds. Now that's a considerable difference in weight. But like I said, once you get a little experience, once you decide if cast iron is something you want to continue on with, then you can start looking at the lighter, older pans. Get that set aside. What's my next question? Check my list here. Okay, people were wondering, do I even really need to strip down a used pan that I get. You can see this Dutch oven's got a fair bit of buildup, not really much. It's got some buildup on the outside. You know, and your great Aunt Flossie gave you a bunch of cast iron pans that she's had, and they got a ton of crud built up on the outside of them. Do I really need to strip them? Not really. It's up to you. If you know where a pan has been, and you know what's been used in it, it's okay to leave it as it is. Although, when you have a heavy buildup on the outside, it can get to be a problem. On the outsides of the pan, it doesn't hurt anything, but a heavy buildup of carbon on the bottom of the pan acts as an insulation, and the pan will heat up a lot slower, and since it's usually worn a bit thinner in the middle than it is around the sides, the pan will heat unevenly, and that can cause it to warp and you make your pan wobble where it wasn't necessarily wobbly before. So even if you don't want to clean the sides of the pan off, you can take a stiff putty knife or something of that sort and scrape the stuff off the bottom, get the carbon off there. It's going to take some doing, it's not easy, but you get the stuff scraped off the bottom, it'll heat evenly again and you'll avoid some of the risks of warping it. And you might find out that it's some kind of a treasure. You'll be able to see if there's any maker's marks on it. Get that set aside. Now, which brings us to stripping pans. Probably the biggest question I get and the most comments are, can I use some sort of abrasive to strip down my pan? Sandblasting, wire wheels, grinders, sanders, sanding discs on a grinder, that sort of thing. As a general rule, even though there's very few absolutes in cast iron, and most of the things I'm going to tell you I'm going to turn around and contradict in one way or another, but as a general rule, you do not want to use abrasives on cast iron until you know exactly what you're using it on. What I mean by that is, a pan like this, I got this for $20. It's a nice pan. I could tell it was an old pan. Had a heavy buildup on it. But once I cleaned it off with lye, I discovered that this is what's known as an artistic logo Erie skillet. It's a number 9. These were made for 1 year in 1906. It's 114 years old, and had I sandblasted or done something terribly abrasive to it, it would have greatly reduced the value. When I get done with this pan, get it all cleaned up and re-seasoned, it's worth about $300 to $350. Had I gone and ground away on that, I could have really reduced that down to just the price of a generic old pan of $30 or $50. There's no sense in needlessly destroying the value of something. Even though this still would have been a perfectly usable pan, would have been a tremendous cooker, you're really hurting yourself badly to go ahead and use abrasives on this. Sandblasting, I've done a fair bit of sandblasting and it would really roughen the inside surface of this. Now, there are other media that you can use for blasting. Glass beads, baking soda, walnut shells, things of that nature, which are much less abrasive or even supposedly non-abrasive. But I don't have any personal experience with them, and that's one of the experiments I'm going to try over the summer and see what happens with it. However, there are times when using an abrasive is the right thing to do. This is a little Wagnerware pan made in late 60s, early 70s. By the late 60s, early 70s, the quality of Wagnerware pans had really dropped. The iron was still fairly good, but they were fairly poorly made. You can see the inside of this pan is really rough. And I'm pretty sure that I can smooth this up with a little sanding, a little grinding, and that'll be one of the subjects of my videos later on. And I also want to try and smooth out a Lodge pan like that one I showed you earlier, just to see what sort of things work best, if there's any real benefit to doing that. I know that using a wire wheel can cause problems because it burnishes the surface. Burnishing you're basically smearing the metal smooth, and it seals up all the little ridges and pores and things that grab onto the seasoning when you season a pan. A pan that's been wire wheeled can be very difficult to get to season, and I'm going to see if we can get around that with some various things. And wire wheels can also wear off raised lettering and things like that really quickly. A brass wheel is softer than cast iron, but if you use a brass wire wheel, it'll leave brass residue on your iron. Also, you don't want to use abrasives because it might remove various letters. This, you probably can't see it very well, but there is some lettering on this, and it's not very deeply cut. I'm not quite sure what it says, and I'll have to clean this pan up. But now that I've got away from abrasives a little bit, stripping pans, like I said, it isn't automatically necessary to strip an old pan just because it's old and cruddy. But in this case, I got this in a box of stuff from a estate sale. This is actually the top or the bottom of an old double skillet set. And although the inside isn't too bad, it would take very little to get this up to the point where you could cook on it. I washed it off and dried it on the stove, and it stinks. If you smell it, which you can't, it smells like a musty old basement. So this is going to have to be stripped down to bare metal to find out what it is and to get rid of that nasty musty smell. This is another pan that I got. I got this at a garage sale, and it had been stripped down at some point and then just given a heavy coat of grease or oil, and it's sticky, thick, nasty stuff. Again, this will clean up pretty easy, but I have to get that off of there no matter what else I do with it. This, well, there's just nothing you can do with this as far as cooking on it now. That's got to be cleaned off. And if you don't know what a pan, where a pan came from and what's been put on it, just as a general rule, it's best to strip unknown pans down to bare metal, because at flea markets and sometimes antique dealers, there's no telling what they put on them to keep them from rusting or try and make them look better than they actually are. So if you don't know where the pan came from, strip it down. If you do, you don't necessarily have to unless you want to, or if there's a heavy buildup of carbon on the bottom. While we're on the subject of stripping, I get a lot of questions about burning pans off in a wood stove, in a bonfire, or putting them in a self-cleaning oven. I have burned them off in open fires and in my wood stove a few times, and I managed to break a pan doing that, and it wasn't because of the fire, it was because I forgot it was in there and threw a big chunk of wood on top of it. But heating pans to a very high temperature, you run a small risk, not a huge one, but a small risk of either warping or cracking the pans. Heavier pans are much less vulnerable to that, but a very light, very thin pan like this old Erie here, there's a good chance that you could cause some sort of damage to it, and you don't want to do that. But I am going to do some experiments. I have some fairly thin, cheap little pans that I can sacrifice in my experimentations and see if we can make them warp, see if I can make them crack, and generally try out some of these ideas and see what actually happens. It could be I'm wrong and everything is perfectly fine to do that way, but we won't know until I actually find out. Clear down some of my visual aids here. Which brings me to my next subject, lead, believe it or not. I've had people say, you have to be careful using those enamel pans, you're going to get lead poisoning. That isn't exactly true. Enamel pans made after 1900 do not contain lead. So this pan, this chicken fryer, is a Birmingham stove and range, and it's a Century series, made in the 1950s. Something like this is perfectly safe to use. There's no lead in the enamel. However, you might come across an old, get a little better angle, you might come across an old pot like this. This, I'm not exactly sure when it was made, but I suspect it was made before 1900 because it has a gate mark on the bottom. A gate mark is a scar left by the opening in the mold where the iron is actually poured in. Most skillet manufacturers got away from doing that in the 1880s. By about 1890 it was pretty much gone. But for bigger things like kettles and pots like this, using the bottom fill gate mark hung on for a while longer, some up into the 1920s, for really big things like really large cauldrons. Hog scalding pots are always poured from the bottom because they're huge. But kettles for boiling down sugar cane or sorghum that held 15-20 gallons, a lot of those were poured from the bottom right up into the 30s and 40s. But anyway, this also has the style of these little ears where the bail attaches. You get over here. This particular style was mostly made before 1900, so I suspect this is old enough that it may have lead in the enamel. Not all pans made before 1900 had lead in the enamel, but 3M makes a lead test swab. I don't have any on hand right now to do it, but you can test to see if there is lead in a non-porous surface like this enamel on this. The other thing you might run across is big kettles like this one very often got used at some point in their life as flower pots. A lot of times they got painted. You'll find them, they got old paint on them, a lot of corrosion on the inside. This one didn't happen to be, but if you find a painted pot, unless you know for sure that it wasn't painted until after about 1985 or so, you have to assume that they used lead paint on it. There's a lot of ways of stripping off the paint, but you have to be concerned about there being lead residue. And again, they make test kits where you can test for the presence of lead. If you have something that you don't know whether it has lead in it, either in the enamel or an old paint residue, don't use it for food. You can use something like that for display, for storing, utensils and whatnot in, but don't use it for food unless you're sure that there's no lead in it. You're not going to run into much of a problem unless it's been painted or it's an extremely old enamel pan, and you're not likely to find a lot of those anyway. Okay, get these out of the way. I've had people ask me about using things other than lye or oven cleaner for stripping down pans, using things like ammonia, lactic acid or citric acid. People know that acidic foods like citric acid from tomato sauce or lactic acid from something like sauerkraut tends to remove seasoning from a pan, and they're wondering if that would be a good way of cleaning a pan. It might be. I don't know. I haven't tried it. The ammonia is a strong base, and alkali will dissolve grease and oil, and it should take off the built-up crud, but I got to do that outside, so that'll have to wait until summer. And I don't know if it would rust the iron or not. I'm going to have to try it and find out. The same goes with citric acid. Well, it's not going to stink. I'm not going to use tomato juice either, because by the time it does any good, it's probably going to get moldy, so I'll use citric acid powder. And we'll get into that later on when I give that a try. It should work out though, or at least it might be useful for derusting or something like that. I don't really know, and I won't know until we give it the experimental try. I've had a couple of questions about electrolysis and finding battery chargers. Shortly after I made the video on using an electrolysis tank, the state of California passed a law that all battery chargers sold in California must be fully automatic, which means that as the battery charges, the current put out by the charger reduces until it eventually shuts off when the battery is fully charged. The problem with an electrolysis tank is it doesn't put enough of a load on the charger for the charger to put out anywhere near its full capacity or even at all for an automatic charger. Manual chargers are getting harder to find. They're still out there, but it's going to be much more common to come across an automatic charger because manufacturers don't want to mess around having to ship one kind of charger to one state and another kind everywhere else. So I'm going to try some experiments putting a battery in the circuit to provide a load on the charger. Basically, the battery will provide the current for the electrolysis tank, and the charger will simply keep the battery charged. But again, gotta wait till spring when I can do that outside. I am going to set up, though, a lye bath and demonstrate how to use that. I can do that, get away with doing that inside, and a vinegar bath for removing rust. So those will be in the fairly near future. Oh, I just remembered something else. Imported cast iron. I've given kind of an impression sometimes that a lot of the things made in China are junk, and that isn't necessarily true. The quality varies quite a bit about Chinese-made cast iron. A lot of the celebrity chef brand names, a lot of store brand names are fairly decent, but there is some stuff that is absolutely junk. And I'm going to get into that in a video where I try and show some of the good and bad stuff that's imported, mostly from Asia. I have some European imported stuff, which is kind of nice, and we'll get into that later on too, because that's something I can do before spring gets here. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I look forward to doing some of these experiments. I might prove myself wrong on a lot of stuff, and hopefully I do if it is actually wrong, but if I prove myself right, I'll be much more confident in what I know. I'll see y'all later. Goodbye.